Tori, and thanks for the opportunity to visit with you all tonight. First, just want to kind of cover some of the, I guess, what we refer to as the equation of reproduction. All these, Jordan had talked about a lot of times. It's a systems approach. It's not one simple thing that will solve any problem that you may have with the breeding program, but it's a combination of a lot of different things that are involved with the synchronization AI programs. So I guess just a quick example here, you've got your Estrus response. In this first example here, you've got 100% Estrus response. So you're doing a timed insemination program where you're breeding 100% of the animals. Inseminator efficiency, Dr. Dalton touched on that a little bit earlier. You're getting approximately 90% efficiency from an inseminator standpoint. We talked a little bit about herd fertility tonight as well. Making sure those cows are right body condition score, making sure those heifers are developed correctly. And then again, looking at semen fertility, a 90% semen fertility. So when you multiply all of these different effects across here, ideal situations, perfect situations, things are working great. Overall success rate, could possibly be 73%. So if we take a look, going from the first example with a timed insemination to the second example where you're doing a heat detection program, a good 85% heat response is good. All things considered across there, keeping other things constant, you can go from a 73% overall success rate as far as your insemination on a group of cows from 73% down to 62%. Looking at another example, maybe where inseminator efficiency isn't quite up to par. Maybe it's somebody that just went through an AI training course, just starting to get their feet wet in the AI process. You can see pretty quickly that any drop in one of these factors that go into the whole equation, you see a pretty drastic reduction in the overall success rate. Another example here, looking at semen fertility, we talked a couple times tonight about sex semen, the use of sex semen, and there may be other instances where semen isn't handled properly, semen isn't thawed properly, in the transportation process of it, maybe it isn't handled quite correctly as well. You can see how that changes there. Again, can affect that overall success rate of your AI program. And then finally, when we look at the bottom example here, we've got maybe a 70% estrus response, which is acceptable yet as well, but a little bit of reduction in herd fertility. Maybe these are cows that are a little bit thinner body condition score, might not be carrying enough body condition to be prime candidates for a synchronization program. And that's one thing I kind of want to touch on tonight is if you're getting your feet wet, if you're getting started with an AI program, maybe identifying those prime candidates to start with the first year to get some success under your belt, but also like Jordan just mentioned in the last presentation, all of those cows are for optimal reproduction, all of those cows are probably going to benefit from a synchronization program to get those cows to breed back quicker in the breeding season, then potentially calve early in the subsequent calving season. So when we talk about all that stuff, some of the logistics of starting an AI program, this slide here is going to kind of give you a quick rundown of the things we're going to touch on in my presentation tonight. Working facilities. That's probably for us in the industry, that's probably one of the quickest things we look at on when we pull into a new location or when we go stop and visit with a new potential customer is, do they have facilities to perform all of this? Jordan also talked about, the times that you will work cattle at least 3 times to do a timed insemination program. Can you gather cattle and work them efficiently that many times in a reasonable time frame? You're going to be breeding a group of heifers or you're going to be breeding a group of cows. There's different management, different synchronization programs for those different groups of females. Also different management things, with cows, you've got to worry about calves outside, sorting off calves, different management, criteria for those animals. Also touched on tonight was a little bit about the estrus detection and whether you're going to be detecting estrus or whether cows are going to be set up for a straight fixed time AI. Next, who's going to be doing the AI? Are you going to be doing that yourself as a trained technician, someone that's gone through an AI school, has been AI in cows for maybe possibly many years? Or are you going to have that hired out? Are you going to hire somebody to come in and do that work for you? Some of the supplies needed to get that accomplished. I'm going to touch briefly a little bit on which sire you should choose. Dr. Dalton talked about earlier about some of the sire effects and looking at breeding philosophies as far as what you want to do, developing replacement females for yourself, or whether you're going to be selling all your calves as maybe a terminal cross. And then also visit a little bit about where do you purchase semen and those criteria. Dr. Thomas just visited quite a bit about synchronization protocols, which options there are. Just going to touch briefly again on the products that we use to synchronize estrus in beef cattle and the products that are listed on the estrus synchronization protocol pages and the correct use of those products. So to begin with, when we look at cattle handling facilities and cattle handling crews, do you have the facilities on your place to gather cattle in a reasonable time frame, gather cattle in an efficient time frame, keeping them calm, keeping things, working, cattle flow working consistently. That can make your life a lot easier if you do have the facilities to get this accomplished. If you don't, maybe there's a few tweaks or little additions or changes here and there that could be really beneficial as far as the flow of cattle through facilities. There are also the opportunity to bring in portable facilities. There are a lot of portable corrals, alleyways, chutes. And the bottom left down here, we see a portable AI barn that can be set in front of existing facilities. A lot of these are investments that either farms or ranches make, or investments that AI companies like ourselves have invested in to provide to make this process that's a little simpler, make this process a little bit easier. And then finally, just talking about cattle handling facilities, just avoiding the stressors, avoiding that person that's back there yelling at the top of their lungs at everybody, stressing the cows, stressing everybody else in that situation, working cattle calmly. I mentioned here also untrained dogs, or maybe people using a shocker or hot shots. Anything that's going to cause stress to that cow during this whole process is going to affect your overall results and overall success of an AI program. So when we look at some of the criteria, and this has been touched on a little bit as well through some of the presentations tonight, but some of the criteria you want your heifers as far as considering them as good candidates. And Dr. Thomas mentioned this a little too, as looking at the pregnancy rate of your heifers the last couple of years. If you're struggling to get 75 to maybe 80% of your heifers bred in what I would call a controlled breeding season, a 60 to maybe 80-day breeding season, there's probably some other things we need to address before we start a synchronization program, before we start an AI program, before you do that. Ideally, you'd want to have, probably 85 to 95% of your heifers conceiving in a 60-day breeding season to be good candidates for an AI program. Next question I would have is, have your heifers received growth promoting implants? There's data out there that show that heifers that are implanted at a young age, growth promoting implants can affect the reproductive development of those heifers and the physiological maturity of those heifers' reproductive tract. They may look perfectly fine on the outside, but the reproductive tract may not be fully developed. Have you selected an appropriate target weight for your heifers? There's a little difference in, research out there going from a 55 to 65% of your mature weight, ensuring those heifers are developed correctly throughout their lifetime. Not just looking at those heifers right before the time of insemination, but watching those heifers once they're weaned, keeping them on an increasing plane of nutrition, getting them to grade or getting them to continue to grow at appropriate, daily gain. Is something to think about, from a long-term perspective, not just, right at the time of insemination. One other thing to think about, if you're not sure about groups of heifers, not sure kind of where you're starting at with that group of heifers, is maybe doing the reproductive tract score. Reproductive tract scores are done by rectally palpating the uterus and ovary of those heifers and evaluating them as far as their physiological or reproductive development maturity. So reproductive tract score of what we would call a 4 and a 5 are heifers that are started cycling. Another way to do this as well is maybe put, estrus detection patches on those heifers just to get an idea of how many of those heifers are cycling before you start a synchronization program. Ideally, you'd like to see close to 50% or more of them cycling before you start a synchronization program. One other thing, you can visit with your veterinarian as well is ensuring you're on the, these heifers been vaccinated correctly, have had their pre-breeding vaccinations done well before breeding season start, 35 to 45 days before breeding season. I'd also encourage you, Dr. George Perry did a webinar this spring that's on the Beef Repro YouTube channel that covers a lot of this from a vaccination program and timing of those vaccination programs to get the optimal success rate with your beef heifers. Another thing to consider, and we touched on this a little bit, is just appropriate heifer development from a nutritional and mineral standpoint. I would encourage you to visit with nutritionists or people in your area. The mineral program that works in the eastern part of the U.S. is maybe not the same nutritional and mineral program that works in the western part of the U.S. or vice, anywhere across the U.S. or across the country, across the world. So when we look at cows, what criteria your cows should meet. Again, what is the pregnancy rate in your cows been in the past few years? Are you successfully getting, 85 to 95% of your cows pregnant, again, within what I would call controlled breeding season, 60, 80 days. If you're not reaching those goals, again, maybe there's other things we need to address before that. Dr. Jordan mentioned earlier as well, if you're starting an AI program, maybe we need to use a synchronization program with natural service to kind of group those cows up a little bit as well. With cows, we look more at the body condition score of the cows than the weight of the cows. Looking at the body condition score of the cows at calving, prior to calving, but also looking at the current body condition score of those cows, right before an artificial insemination program or synchronization program. When we look at cow body condition score, beef cow body condition scores range from a 1 to a 9, 1 being extremely thin, and a 9 will be essentially an obese beef cow. Ideally, we want to see our cows in that 5, 6, 7 body condition score range. At the point where we're not really seeing the ribs much, those hip bones and that tail head are looking a little bit smoother. They're carrying more condition on their back, having the energy reserves to, calve in and, successfully lactate while also begin to start cycling again for a synchronization program. Jordan Thomas answered a little bit of this, as far as your days post-calving or your days postpartum before you start a synchronization program. And I agree with him 100%. If you're a commercial herd, anything that's over 21 days post-calving, use a progestin-based synchronization program to help tighten up that group of females. That female may not conceive to the AI artificial insemination, but she'll breed either to that second AI service or to the wool breeding more quickly than she would if she was not synchronized. Again, visit with your veterinarian, making sure your vaccination program is up to date. And again, from an adequate nutrition and mineral standpoint for those females. And those vary based on the time of the year as well, based on the forages that are being provided to those females at that time as well. So if you're going to synchronize a group of cows, you're going to use maybe estrus detection. You're going to be detecting those heifers. You need to commit someone or a group of people to doing that estrus detection on those females. And I say that because, and they need to be what I would refer to as qualified people that can, either ride out into a pen, identify those females that are in heat, that are in standing heat, or have been ridden based on maybe estrus detection aids or other devices. It's not just a job that anybody can go out and do to identify females that are in standing heat that need to be bred. With estrus detection, typically we follow what we refer to as the AM/PM rule. Females that are in standing estrus in the morning would then get inseminated in the evening, and the females in standing estrus in the evening would get AI'd that following morning. One thing I would definitely encourage to do is, if you are doing estrus detection, use the estrus detection aids, use the Estrus, use the KMARs. There are systems out there as well, neck collar based systems, ear tag systems that will detect females in heat as well, to allow you to identify those animals that have shown estrus. So the data I've put down here on the bottom is from what George Perry presented back in 2018 at the ARSBC meetings as well. when we look at the time of day when cows exhibit a standing estrus. So typical daylight hours, for us up here, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., we're getting a little bit less, or around 45% of those cows, 45% of those cows showing estrus during that time. The biggest challenge, especially when we get into the days when daylight hours get much shorter, when it's gets dark at 6 p.m. at night and doesn't get light until 6 a.m., 55% of those cows are showing heat over that time frame. If we're not using an estrus detection aid, if we're not using a estrus detection system, we're going to miss out on those cows unless somebody is committed to go out there with some sort of a light source and identify those cows that are standing in heat overnight. Touch a little bit on the AI supplies that are needed for artificial insemination. And I also want to point out here, Dr. Joe Dalton did a webinar this spring as well for the Beef Reproduction Task Force, and that is on the YouTube channel. He does a very, very good job going through little things with the AI process that can affect your success rate. I highly encourage you to take the time to listen to that as well. For me, the biggest thing with AI equipment is keeping it maintained, keeping that equipment clean and organized. So when you are doing the insemination, you're not taking 4 or 5 seconds to find this, or you forgot to have that. Checking those electronic thaw units, making sure that water temperature is the ideal 95-degree temperature, making sure those semen tanks are maintained, making sure they're filled on a regular basis. If the liquid nitrogen gets too low in the semen tanks, and that whole batch or every straw of semen within that tank can be damaged or lost. So like I said, the biggest thing is maintaining that equipment. One thing to consider as well is, depending on what source you're buying semen from, whether that straw is packaged in a 0.5 cc straw or a 1/4 cc straw. That will depend on maybe which AI gun you get purchased to perform the insemination as well. We visited a little bit about technician earlier, and in the dairy industry, we can pretty easily pull out data looking at different technicians, doing inseminations on a particular farm. We can look at the total number of breedings that technician has done. And then, on the right over here, we have the conception rate or the success rate of that technician on that particular farm. We do see differences in technician performance. These may be trained technicians. These may be, newer technicians that are starting off as well. It may be something as simple as going in, doing a refresher course with maybe this technician number 3 here, that's at a 26% conception rate versus everyone else on here, which is at upper 30s or low 40s. Again, this is dairy data. So if, upper 30s to mid 40s conception rate is very acceptable in the dairy industry. So again, it's maybe doing some retraining, working with that individual, making sure they're getting everything accomplished, in the manner that needs to be done. Or it may be, certain technicians just may not be physically capable of performing the artificial insemination process successfully. On the bottom down here, we have a couple more examples. Technician 4 here has a 38% conception rate, whereas technician number 6 is at a 24% conception rate. Again, it may be simple as some retraining, simple as working on the AI technique or semen handling process, or it may be, that we maybe need to have technician do other jobs on the farm. So when we talk about synchronizing big groups of cows, talk about synchronizing, a large group of cows with a timed AI program where all cows need to be inseminated within a reasonably short time frame. One of the biggest things you want to make sure that you have the AI technicians yourself or people that you have hired that are capable of handling that tasks. Someone that is fresh out of an AI school is not someone that I'm going to throw out there and have breed, big groups of cows. Maybe it's, if you've gone through an AI class, you want to get your feet wet, go synchronize a group of maybe 10 or 15 cows, do some heat detection where you're breeding a few cows to make sure you're competent, you're confident in your skills to get the task performed. So I'm going to visit a little bit briefly, and Dr. Dalton touched on this a little bit earlier as well, and Dr. Troy Rowan will go into more detail tomorrow When you look at sire selection, when you look at your choices that you have out there, you have a large selection of bulls that are available for you to use. Every breed is available, you know, a lot of different options within breeds as well. The one thing I would say is just have a plan. You know, whether you are going to be retaining females that you develop with your breeding program, retain those females back into your herd as replacement females. Those will then become the cows in your herd. You know, select bulls that are going to work well for that selection criteria. And we look at the complete opposite end of that. You know, are you breeding for strictly a terminal cross type animal, a type of animal that's going to give you as many pounds as you can for weaning and perform well in the feedlot and from a carcass quality standpoint? You know, these are maybe animals that you're not going to be keeping into your herd, so you just want total performance. You know, and then after that, it's, you know, maybe looking at maybe a balanced approach. You know, you want those cattle that are going to perform well in a feedlot, perform well on grass, perform well from a carcass standpoint, but you also want those type of cattle that will make good replacement females for you and your herd. This also was touched a little bit on tonight is, you know, the opportunity to use sex semen. There is the opportunity to use gender selected semen to make replacement females. Maybe you want to target some of the cows in your herd, which you want replacement females out of. You can use female sex semen to try to make that possible to get those females out of the top end of your herd. Also consider that, you know, there are some drawbacks to sex semen as well. Dr. Thomas mentioned a little bit earlier, you know, picking the protocol that will help you be a little more successful with sex semen. Sex semen at this time, fertility is not quite to what the conventional semen is. As you saw that in some of the 7 and 7 data that he showed, you know, with a low 70% conception rate on conventional semen, and maybe low 50% conception rate with sex semen. There's opportunities there, but understand that there are also drawbacks to that. Finally, just want to, you know, say, you know, do your homework. If you're using this bull to make the next generation of females in your herd, get as much information as possible as you can. Visit with the AI organization that is marketing that bull. Visit with some of the maybe breeders. If you're a purebred breeder, visit with the breeders that have seen females in production, that have seen calves out of that bull. Do your homework and then make the best choice that you can for the long-term success. You know, several years ago, I listened to a presentation, and the breeding decisions that you make today are decisions that you're going to live with for probably the next 10 years. By the time that cow calves, that heifer is then retained back in your herd, and then that heifer becomes a producing female in your herd. So, you know, like I said, put some time into your sire selection. One other question, you know, and I'm going to throw this out here. This is a study back when I was at University of Missouri. We did a large field demonstration where we were taking synchronization programs out in the field, working with producers that maybe had AI before, and also working with producers that had never AI before. Through that whole process, you know, the producer was choosing the semen that he was using during those breeding programs. And this was back in the late 2008, 2009, when we were doing this. So at that time, there would be what I would call 4 major AI companies. With this field demonstration program, you know, we had just over 6,700 breedings with semen from what I would say would be one of the 4 major AI companies that are under the National Association of Animal Breeders quality standards and semen quality parameters. So we had a 61% success rate. This is with the 7-day coasting plus cedar program. 31 sires were used. Only 3 of those 31 were below 50%. Like I said, several of these people were using bulls that they chose. Maybe it was a bull that they owned, that they had custom collected at a facility. Maybe it was semen from, you know, a different breeder that they had collected as well. A much smaller sample size here, 276 inseminations with this from custom collection site semen, 49% overall conception rate. You know, 16 sires here, and 7 of those were below a 50%. So I say that because, you know, taking your bull maybe to a custom collection facility, not really knowing what kind of quality product you have when you come home, it may be perfectly fine. It may be great success, but it also may not be. That is one of the advantages of large AI organizations, and also the addition of using beef on dairy now, is we can send a lot of semen from these young bulls out to large dairies and have data back within 60 days on how those bulls are working from a fertility standpoint. So I just want to touch briefly, as you look at the Estrus synchronization protocol pages, you're going to see all these synchronization products. You've got your GnRH products and the name brands of those GnRH products. You've got your PG or prostaglandin products and the name brands of them as well. Now, for me, the biggest thing with these products, these are all injectable products, making sure they're stored according to label directions. Some suggest, a controlled temperature, some are not so much of a controlled temperature as far as product storage. Follow the label dosage. One good example is, Lutelyse is a 5 ml dose, whereas Lutelyse high concentration is a 2 ml dose. Ensuring you're giving that correct dosage to those females with those synchronization protocols. And if you're giving that product as an intramuscular product, using the right gauge of needle, right length of needle to ensure that product is given within the muscle and stays within the muscle, that you're not letting that product, leak out after the injection. Dr. Thomas, mentioned earlier as well, he's got a video on cedar handling, cedar insertion. Again, encourage you to go back and look at those and take the time to watch those. For me, the biggest thing with cedars is just, it's a vaginal insert. It's staying in there from 7 to 14 days, ensuring that you are inserting that in the cleanest manner that you can, avoiding any contamination from manure or dirt while you're putting that cedar in. Cleaning that applicator, this green device here is the cedar applicator, cleaning that applicator thoroughly in between each cedar insertion, going from one animal to the next. MGA is an orally available product. That is a product that's put in feed as far as heifer consumption. It's only approved in beef heifers as well. The biggest thing again is just ensuring adequate bunk space with this product, and ensuring consistent feed delivered to every heifer. Because if that heifer doesn't get her daily dose of that MGA product, she's not going to respond to that synchronization program as well as she potentially could. One thing over the years, we at Select Sires have put together what we refer to as a checklist. And it's got a lot of these different things that I've discussed about, from cow management, heifer management, from a nutrition standpoint, from a herd health standpoint. These are things that, visit with your veterinarian, visit with your nutritionist. And these are things that are, has been mentioned a couple of times tonight. These are a systems approach. These are things that we need to be looking at several months ahead of a breeding season, not just right before breeding season, because if there are changes we need to make sure those are implemented to make those heifers or those cows ideal candidates for an AI program. This was also mentioned a couple of times tonight too. Use the Estrus synchronization planner. Plan your synchronization protocol out. Plan your breeding programs out. Make sure you have people available if you need extra help to implement these programs. Make sure it's not planned on a day where you have something else scheduled for your kids or for other individuals in your family. Some other considerations just to think about. One thing that can be frustrating for us from a standpoint of, we have somebody call and they say, well, we had a wreck this year. And we start asking the questions of, were the correct synchronization products given? Was this done? Was that done? What kind of estrus response did you see? And a lot of times, unless you keep records, you don't have an idea. A lot of times people can't remember distinctly what happened the previous year as far as, what potential things are contributing to that lower success rate. We talked on the very first slide about the equation of reproduction. Let's try to pinpoint where in that equation we're having some faults, where we're maybe lacking in that equation to achieve overall optimal success rate. I'd also say there, plan ahead. Whether you're implementing this program yourself or whether you're bringing in people to implement that program, we're planning several months ahead as far as AI organizations providing technician services to you. you've got to have somebody planned ahead. It's not a thing where you can call, a week ahead and say, hey, can you show up and breed cows? We'll do the best we can to make that happen. But if we've got things on the calendar, we can plan ahead. Makes life a lot easier for everybody. Even from a semen availability standpoint, identify those sires that you want to use and make sure you've got them on hand before, well ahead of the AI date. One thing I'd also mention too is, you've put all the work into getting these females, whether cows or heifers, to respond the best you can to a synchronization program, AI program. Try to keep things as consistent as possible following that AI program to ensure, those heifers don't have any additional stresses as far as nutritional changes or any other stress to them at that point. If you do have questions, reach out to people in the AI industry, reach out to people on the Beef Reproduction Task Force. We all would be happy to help you walk through synchronization and AI programs. And lastly, I would say, relax and enjoy the process. As long as you've planned ahead, you've done everything you can to make that process as simple as possible. Take the time to enjoy the process. This is a part of your life. This is a decision you've made to implement. Follow it through the best you can. Yes, there will be bumps and changes along the way, but make the best of it.
And then thank you very much. I agree with you. I always tell students, one of the things that I like the most is go out and breed cows, right? It's like, it is fun. And I think the more fun we have, the best the results we also get. So I agree with you on that. I want to remind everyone to please send questions through the Q&A tab. And we'll try to get them answered here. So then you touched on this a little bit already, about differences in technicians. We have a question about that, and whether or not some of the larger AI companies would reimburse clients for a technician failure.
So I guess the answer to that question is, you go back to the reproduction equation. There are so many variables that can affect the success. Unless you've got the accurate records to specifically say this technician was 20% lower than the other, then we can't really have that conversation yet. That said, most of the time, if we're providing technicians for the breeding project, we are going to ensure they are qualified technicians. Unless you're doing large volumes, there will still be various differences just based on the random chance of the cows that those technicians got to breed. Unless it's large volumes, you can't distinctly say this technician is lower than the other.
On the same topic, what do you tell someone that wants to get experience, right? And we work with some producers and want to breed their own cows. What would be your advice for someone?
Yeah, so a lot of times for people that have gone through maybe an AI class that I've taught is, I'll encourage them, let's set up a group of cows. The first year, if you set up a group of cows, large enough for us to justify going to help, is we'll come help you breed. We'll let you breed some of the cows. We will help breed some of the cows. We'll get the whole process accomplished that first year. And it's the next year is when the next opportunity will be for that person to get those opportunities as well. And that is one challenge of the beef industry and AI in the beef industry. It is a very seasonal business, and getting, for individuals on their own herds, getting enough experience in the short time frame and then waiting, maybe a year later to get that experience again can be a challenge.